All right, so today we're diving deep into something pretty fascinating. We're going beyond our borders to explore how Iranians view the U.S. election.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's not just about red versus blue over there.
Right.
For a lot of Iranians, the U.S. election, it's about so much more.
Yeah,
It's intertwined with their hopes, their expectations, and also their anxieties
yeah.
about the future of U.S.-Iran relations.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't really separate the election from that long history between our two countries.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. The 1953 coup, the hostage crisis,
Right.
sanctions, those events. For Iranians, those aren't just chapters in a history book.
Yeah.
They really shape their perception of U.S. power and how it could affect their lives.
Yeah, I guess it's like watching a movie sequel,
Uh-huh.
and you're not really sure if you're going to get a happy ending or if you're going to get left hanging on another cliffhanger.
That is a great analogy. There's this mix of anticipation
Yeah.
and apprehension, right? Some Iranians, they hope for a change in U.S. foreign policy, maybe a shift towards dialogue, diplomacy.
Right.
But there's also this underlying fear that things could get worse, especially given how unpredictable things are in global politics these days.
So it's like cautious optimism mixed with a bit of what if.
Exactly. And that uncertainty, it's amplified by the fact that the U.S. election, it can really impact Iran's economy
Oh, for sure.
and their political landscape.
And speaking of different perspectives, our sources indicate that Iranian views on the actual candidates, they're pretty varied.
Oh, yeah,
It's
absolutely.
not as simple as being pro this or anti that candidate.
No, not at all. Like, take Trump, for example.
Okay.
Some Iranians see him as a real wild card. Like, on one hand, they see him as unpredictable, maybe even volatile.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they also see him as a potential disruptor, someone who could shake things up, break the status quo, and they think maybe he'd be open to direct negotiations, even if it meant breaking from traditional U.S. foreign policy.
So there's this paradoxical appeal in his unpredictability.
Right.
It's like, well, we know the usual ways haven't really worked, so maybe a shake-up IS, what's needed.
Exactly. They see him as someone who operates outside the norms, which could be concerning
Yeah.
or hopeful, depending on your viewpoint.
It really depends how you look at it. Now, with Kamala Harris, the perspective seems to shift to something a little more symbolic.
Yeah, you're right. The idea of a female U.S. president, it's seen as a potential turning point. Some Iranians believe it could really change global gender dynamics, inspiring women in Iran and around the world to pursue leadership roles.
So it's not just her policies, but the message her presidency sends.
Precisely. And there's another layer here. Some Iranians feel a cultural connection with Harris because of her South Asian heritage.
Oh, interesting.
The shared Indo-Iranian linguistic roots,
Right.
the influence of Persian literature and poetry, all of that adds to a sense of connection, even though she represents a country that has often been an adversary.
It's amazing how something like a U.S. election, seemingly distant to them, can spark hope and even a sense of kinship in another part of the world. I feel like this deep dive is already showing us how connected we all are, despite those geographical and political boundaries.
Absolutely. It really speaks to the power of culture and that human desire for connection, even when things are politically complex.
This is fascinating, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface. What else can you tell us about how Iranians see this election? What are they hoping for, and what are their biggest concerns?
Well, let's dive deeper into those specific hopes and fears, and some interesting perspectives on the future of U.S.-Iran relations.
Welcome back to our exploration of Iranian perspectives on the U.S. election. As we go deeper, I think we're going to uncover some more of the nuances of their hopes and fears around this election. Yeah, in part one, we talked about how history really colors the way Iranians see this U.S. election.
Right.
It's not just about the candidates themselves, but also the potential effects on their lives.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what are some of the things that Iranians are hoping for from this election?
Well, one thing that keeps coming up in our sources is this desire for mutual respect and understanding. A lot of Iranians feel that the U.S. has mischaracterized their country, demonize it even, portraying it through stereotypes and fear-mongering.
Right.
They really yearn for a relationship built on real dialogue.
Yeah.
And a recognition of their rich history and culture.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, no one wants to be reduced to a caricature.
Right.
Like, especially on the world stage.
Right.
It's like being judged based on a few sensationalized news headlines.
Exactly.
Instead of being seen as complex individuals with diverse perspectives.
Yeah, and that feeling of being misunderstood, it fuels a desire for a more nuanced and balanced approach from the U.S.,
Yeah.
one that acknowledges their humanity and their agency.
So beyond this hope for respect, are there any specific policy changes that Iranians are looking for?
A lot of our sources point to the lifting of sanctions as a really important step towards improving relations.
Okay.
They argue that sanctions have crippled the Iranian economy
Hmm.
and caused a lot of hardship for ordinary people while doing very little to change the government's behavior.
Right.
It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by shutting off the water to the whole house, you know? It creates more problems than it solves.
It sounds like they see sanctions as this blunt instrument that hurts the people but doesn't address the actual issues.
That's a common sentiment, and it goes back to that yearning for a more balanced and empathetic approach from the U.S.
Yeah.
Many Iranians feel that sanctions are counterproductive. You know, they push Iran further from the negotiating table instead of bringing it closer.
Okay, so we've talked about this hope for mutual respect, the desire for sanctions relief. What about the flip side? What are some of the anxieties that Iranians are facing as they watch this U.S. election unfold?
Well, one of the biggest fears that the U.S. will take a more aggressive stance towards Iran, escalating tensions and maybe even leading to military conflict.
Right.
This fear is rooted in past interventions like the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which many Iranians believe destabilized the whole region.
So it's not just abstract political differences, but a real fear of war and what it could mean for their lives.
Exactly. The possibility of war is a big part of their thinking.
Yeah.
And it influences how they see the U.S. election. They're looking for any signs of aggression or escalation, hoping for de-escalation and a more peaceful way forward.
Now, going back to the candidates, we talked about the different views on Trump and Harris. Some see Trump as someone who might break the mold, while others are really wary of his unpredictability.
Right.
And with Harris, there's a sense of hope tied to her as a symbol of progress, especially for women.
Yeah, those contrasting perceptions highlight the complexity of Iranian views on the U.S. election. It's not about simply favoring one candidate or the other,
Right.
but a more nuanced assessment of what they might mean for Iran's future.
So given all of this, what does the future hold for U.S.-Iran relations? Is there any common ground to be found amidst all this history and these complex political realities?
That's the big question, and it's one that many Iranians are wrestling with. Our sources offer some interesting hints at what a more ideal but also realistic relationship could look like. It involves a shift in perspective, a willingness to look past stereotypes and really engage in genuine dialogue.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's explore those possibilities further in Part 3. Part 3 of our deep dive. We'll uncover what a more hopeful future for U.S.-Iran relations might look like, and we'll even delve into some surprising cultural connections that might pave the way for greater understanding. Welcome back to our deep dive. In Part 2, we talked about the possibility of a more hopeful future for U.S.-Iran relations, and I'm really interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, and you know what? I think this is where it gets really fascinating because we have to look beyond just politics
Okay.
and start thinking about cultural connections.
Right, you mentioned before that some Iranians see Kamala Harris's South Asian heritage as a point of connection, even a source of hope.
Exactly, and that's just one example. Our sources actually suggest there's a deeper cultural link between Iran and the West, especially when it comes to things like literature
Mm.
and poetry.
I've always loved Persian poetry, especially Rumi. His themes of love, longing, searching for meaning, they feel so universal.
It's amazing, isn't it? Figures like Rumi, Hafiz, Omar Khayyam, celebrated not just in Iran, but globally. Their words go beyond culture, beyond politics, reminding us of that shared humanity we have.
So even though Iran and the U.S. seem so different politically, we share this common ground in appreciating art and literature.
Exactly. And it goes both ways.
Oh.
Western literature has influenced Iranian writers and intellectuals, too. It's this fascinating exchange of ideas and perspectives.
Yeah, it's like culture can act as a bridge, helping us see past the political stuff and connect as humans. But can poetry and literature really change things when there's such deep political conflict?
That's a great question, and it's tough to answer. You see, politics and culture, they're definitely connected, but they move at different speeds. Political change, that can happen fast, but cultural shifts take time.
Okay.
It's about planting seeds, encouraging dialogue, fostering those real human connections.
So we might not see a sudden change in relations just because people are reading Rumi,
Right.
but it could help build a more understanding, empathetic relationship over time.
Absolutely. It's about creating a space where people from different cultures can meet, not as political entities, but as people with shared hopes, anxieties.
As humans.
Exactly.
Mm.
And that's where the real hope might be. If we can connect on that human level, maybe we can start breaking down those political walls.
I love that.
It's a powerful idea. And it might not be so far-fetched. Our sources suggest that Iranians are ready for a better relationship with the U.S., but it has to be based on mutual respect, a real willingness to see things from their side.
This deep dive has been so insightful. It's shown me how complex Iranian perspectives on the U.S. election really are. It's not just about choosing a president.
Right.
It's about hope, anxiety, history, culture.
Yeah.
It's about longing for a more peaceful, connected world.
I think you've summed it up perfectly. And maybe that's the most important thing to take away from this whole deep dive. Remember to look beyond the headlines.
Yeah.
Engage with different viewpoints. And never underestimate the power of human connection.
Beautifully said. And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep exploring the world with an open mind and heart. Until next time, keep diving deep.